The Insight.
Insight.
The Insightome.
Podcast.
Genetics.
Human.
Archaeology.
Denisovans.
Neanderthals.
Metabolism.
Ancestry.
Where in the world did we come from?
I am.
Unique DNA.
Genome. From Austin,
Texas.
This week, the Indo-European Enigma. Razib, tell me about yourself.
I am a scientist at a company called Insightome, and
That's how you pronounce it.
How do you pronounce it?
Incitomi.
Wait, is this going internationally? Maybe that's it's branding for the foreign market.
No, people always have trouble with the name.
Oh, okay.
So incito is Italian for inherent.
Okay.
So it's got that other meaning.
Wait, you're serious?
Yeah.
Okay. The more you know. Okay, I'm learning. Things
But it came from insights.
Okay, yeah.
Insights and genome, proteome, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Metabolome.
Yeah.
So this is the Insightome. What we
Yeah.
do is we provide insights.
Yep, and I am here to help provide insights. I am director of scientific content, so hopefully, I will clarify things for listeners in the future
Awesome.
and in the present.
So you've been involved in a debate recently.
Yeah, I have been involved in a debate. It's not of my own choosing, I would say, because I don't think it is a debate as much as a discussion. But so to give a quick background, with genetics today, we have much more powerful tools to explore the questions that we ask. And, a couple of years ago, let's say like 10, 15 years ago, as Spencer knows, genomic technologies started coming on the market, and they were expensive, and so they were limited to very specific questions, and the population.
So this is whole genome sequencing, and
Instead of looking at like 100 markers, which is genetics,
Mm-hmm.
we're looking at hundreds of thousands of markers, which is genomics, and like ultimately the whole genome, 3 billion base pairs. That's the whole shebang. But really, like, you want to look at the variant markers initially, just for reasons of cost, right? So, you have all this data, the technology gets cheaper and cheaper, and you can start asking other questions beyond your original, usually it would be like medical stuff you start out. That's like, cost versus benefit. That's what the funders will fund. But now you can get into, answering a lot of historical questions. So, over the last like 5 years or so, I would say, there's several groups of researchers that have been solving human history. I mean, to be a little,
No, and the big thing that's happened, there have been two advances. This is at least what I talk about when I give lectures on this stuff. One is obviously the development of cheap, rapid whole genome sequencing technologies. So that's next-gen, post-2007, led by Illumina, et cetera, et cetera. The second is ancient DNA technology, which kind of spun out of that next-gen sequencing. And ancient DNA, in my opinion, is the most important advance in human population genetics ever, probably since DNA sequencing first came along.
I mean, it'll be beyond, right? I mean, ancient DNA will start with humans because that's what people really care about. It's expensive right now, but it will become a commodity method within the next 5 to 10 years. The number of labs that can do ancient DNA is increasing literally exponentially year by year. So, we will have ancient DNA in a lot of organisms too, and we already do. We have extinct organisms like various types of elephants, mammoths, sequence.
Yeah, George Church trying to resurrect a mammoth.
Which
How do you feel about that?
That is a different podcast. That is a different podcast.
Okay, we'll return to that.
Yeah, that is a different podcast. So the controversy, like, not to beat around the bush so that people know what Spencer and I are alluding to, is one of the questions that genetics is just currently starting to not explore, because this actually started 20 years ago and Spencer was part of it, I would say, and that is the population history and structure of South Asia, the Indian subcontinent. And my interest in it is just because I'm interested in history and I'm interested in genetics, and it's 25% of the world's population, so not going to really ignore it. The problem, or where the debate comes in, is it has a huge political valence, and Spencer actually knows this in a somewhat different way, way back when he first started exploring these questions. And I think I'll hand it off to you because you have a story which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this was back in the late 90s. Ychromosome was just getting off the ground. In those days, every new marker told a new story. And so when my camera discovered, actually when he was in Lewontin's lab, and I was a PhD student there, M1 or YAP, the Y allopolymorphism, Really interesting distribution in and outside of Africa, and lots of theories spun out of that. Entire PhD theses were written, lots of scientific papers. M3, entry into the Americas, discovered by Peter Underhill at Stanford. M9, which is kind of the out of Africa marker, discovered by Peter Underhill. And then M17 is the one you're talking about. This is one that's widespread all over northern and eastern Europe, but also found down in India. And looking at the distribution, it pretty much exactly overlaps with the nomadic pastoralists who lived there. The thinking being that during the Bronze Age, these people who developed horse husbandry, initially it was for food supply, but eventually they became a mode of transportation that they rode into battle, gave them a huge advantage in warfare. These people, these Bronze Age steppe nomads, spread all over this huge swath of Eurasia. And that kind of ran counter, particularly because we were talking about Y chromosomes, so these are men moving around, ran counter to a lot of ideas in archaeology and anthropology, which were basically that cultural diffusion explained everything, all the patterns, and people didn't literally move. There's no kind of Heimat, no homeland that you can find for their particular people and then see them move to another location and replace the people who were there. However, the Y chromosome argues strongly in favor of that model. And so I presented this at a job talk at the University of Cambridge back in, I think it was like 99 or something.
It was about 20 years ago.
And had my wrist slapped by a female, I will say, member of the faculty who said, it's so ridiculous. These theories are out of date. How the hell can you present all this stuff about marauding males? And, I didn't get the job. Long story short.
The ultimate conclusion, though, is Spencer was probably right. We know he was right for Europe because we have a lot of ancient DNA. So we can basically do a temporal transect, which basically means you sample over time in a particular region.
It's like a vertical transect through an archaeological dig.
Yeah. And it looks like Europe has had like at least 2 major pulses of massive population turnover. Now, the natives could just have run away, or they could have just disappeared, or just given their wives to these new men. I would hypothesize that is implausible, knowing human nature. So I think
people don't tend to want to leave behind their homes, and their fields and everything else that supports them. So of course they're going to fight for it.
Yeah, and we see this before the Holocene. We see this in the Pleistocene. There's turnover, right? So we have a really good understanding of Europe at this point. We have somewhat a more tentative understanding of the Near East, but we're starting to gain a good understanding through ancient DNA. Combined with like better statistical methods utilizing this genome-wide data, we are understanding now that population turnover over, say, a 5,000 year interval is the norm, not the exception. So if you see... And
you mentioned dates. I think that's the big revolutionary discovery, is how recent so many of these genetic layers are. Because the thinking for a long time, the thinking that underpinned the whole Genographic project was if you look at indigenous populations living in a particular part of the world, they reflect something about the initial settlement of that region. And it turns out that in many cases they don't.
Yeah. The way I like to illustrate it to people is when the pyramids of Giza were going up in Egypt, Northern Europe did not look, at least genetically, in terms of the people that were there, what they looked like, did not look anything like what we see today.
So what would they have looked like in Northern Europe?
A lot of the people in Western Northern Europe would have been relatively dark. A lot of them would have looked like Sardinians. Right? Very like Southern Europeans.
So darker hair, darker skin.
Darker eyes.
Yeah.
In general, the Nordic phenotype is relatively recent, and it didn't necessarily even come with people. As you know, Spencer, as a bearer of the Nordic phenotype, it came through a fusion of multiple people and then also subsequent selection, which is a different dynamic, which we're not going to highlight in this podcast too much. But that's another aspect of population genetics that's fascinating, and that ancient DNA is also telling us about. Basically,
what about milk, though? Could they digest milk?
No, they could not. So that's recent as well.
That's kind of crazy. And that runs counter to everything that we've been taught, because it was all about the Neolithic and the people who domesticated cattle and sheep and goats. Moved out of the Fertile Crescent. They brought the lactase persistence allele with them. Turns out that's not the case.
Well, they had low levels from what I recall of the papers. I think the Allentoff paper has some stuff on this. And I think also one of Ian Matheson's papers, the steppe people had low levels of the lactase persistence, but really low, like 10%. We would consider them a lactase intolerant population now. and now somehow in Denmark and southern Sweden it's at 90%. So that's within 4,000 years, 4,500 years. So that's really fast.
So strong selection.
That's strong, and which is we saw it. We saw it in the human genomes. That lactase persistent region, the lactase area, is subject to strong selection, right? But we just didn't know what the dates were.
Yeah.
And so what the dates are telling us is a lot of things that we thought were older dates are much more recent dates, right? So going to India, Spencer's original conjecture, I would say that there is a high probability that it's correct. We don't have ancient DNA from India, so we haven't totally resolved it yet. There's still some wiggle room, and what ancient DNA often also does is it does surprise us. So there will probably be surprises. We don't know a lot of specific details, but I think what we do know with extreme confidence, and this is what has caused the problem in terms of the debate, is that a large group of males arrived into the northwest of the subcontinent, in the Copper or Bronze Age period, and they contributed a substantial proportion of the ancestry to the Indian subcontinent. And the high probability is, they were a population that is, let's just say their recent history has been fraught in both India and Europe, which, Spencer, why don't you take it away?
No, it's these Bronze Age nomads.
Yeah.
It's the ancestors of the Xinjiang mummies, the 6'6" guys buried out in Western China who have, red or blonde hair and look totally unlike people living in the region today. But, probably were very closely related to the nomads who lived in the Altai and then further west into Russia and Ukraine. So we have a lot of evidence. We've got stories as well. So if you look at the Vedic texts, they talk about people who are riding horses, and they have a social structure that's probably very similar to the way of life of these steppe nomads. We know linguistically the languages spoken in northern India, at least, are part of the same Indo-European language family. We've known that since the 18th century. William Jones, who was a judge in India, noticed this. And so there's a lot of evidence for, movement between these places. Why is it so controversial?
I mean, the short answer is Indians don't want to be from somewhere else. Okay.
Okay, and that's something that you run into in a lot of indigenous communities around the world. But I think this goes deeper.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's related to colonialism and British ideas that, India is like a mongrel degraded race. I mean, there's a lot of history, a lot of imperialism, a lot of colonialism. In reaction to this, you have a counter model, which basically turns everything upside down. And the idea is the Indo-Europeans came from India. It's called the Out of India model, and it's closely connected to Hindu nationalism, which is a huge political movement. And the current prime minister of India is a Hindu nationalist, comes out of the Hindu nationalist movement. So it's really strange that this somewhat abstruse population genetic and historical question is deeply connected to the self-identity of many modern Indians. Now, this is a relatively recent thing. Even Hindu nationalists in the early part of the 20th century accepted an Aryan invasion, right? So it's the Aryan invasion theory. I mean, that's the phrase that they use, AIT.
Aryans being the older term for these Eastern Indo-European speakers, the Bronze Age steppe nomads.
Yeah, and in India, I mean, in Sanskrit and, I think Avestan is the Iranian language. I mean, that is the term for freeborn, right? So the freeborn classes in their oldest text are called the Arya, and so it's still a word used in India. They're people with the name Aryan. It's just...
But interestingly, at least when we look at genetic markers that are tied in with these people, like M17, the Y chromosome haplogroup that it defines, we don't see high frequencies of those lineages in, say, Germany, who, this is a people who obviously have historically identified with the Aryans, in quotes.
Yeah.
So why is that?
Well, I mean, they have the high frequency of a different allele, or a different haplogroup. So basically, as the Indo-Europeans spread, obviously they were somewhat heterogeneous, right? The earliest layers that we see that, assuming the Pontic steppe model, so there's several models of Indo-European origins, assuming the Pontic steppe models, the earliest layers show males that carry R1b, which is the brother haplogroup to R1a, which is what we're talking about. And then there is turnover, and R1a replaces R1b. What this suggests is, again, paternal lineages and groups of males engage in competition and they replace each other.
So how many people today, back of the envelope calculation, are descendants of the very first R1A guy?
It's on the order of, I know even in India, it's on the order of 10%. that's like 1.3 billion. So half of 130, so it's like 65 million, and then you have huge fractions,
like 50% of Russians.
Yeah,
or something like
I mean,
that.
I think it would be in
It's
the
hundreds of millions.
it could be like 200 million men.
So this guy had a big impact on the world.
It could be like 1 to 200 million men, something like that.
Yeah.
That is a huge, because like, I'm not even including Pakistan and Bangladesh, which have large populations themselves. So I mean, you know, I call this guy the Allfather, you know, because you know, if you look at pre-Indo-European legends, like the older ones, they do exhibit similarities. Hinduism obviously has an Indo-European element, but it's obviously a native development in a lot of ways, and the Indo-European gods like Indra are pretty marginal. But the oldest layers of the Vedas, you know, if you read them, and I have read translations, they do resemble something that you could see in the Prose Edda, which is the Norse mythology. And, you know, within the Norse mythology, you know, going speculative, you could hypothesize, and this has been hypothesized, that, you know, there are two groups of gods, the Asir and the Vanir. And the Asir are, I would say, like more like sky gods, more about like forces of nature, and the Vanir are fertility gods. And they had a war and they merged, and it could be that we're seeing in the Asir and the Vanir a conflict between peoples, you know?
Yep.
So a lot of folklore and mythology, I think that we can go back and mine it to figure out details of what's going on. And that's triggered by genetics. And what the genetics is showing is people are connected, they're related, and they're recently related. Now, how you interpret that is up to you. I myself, I'm going to be honest, I don't really care about that aspect because I'm an individualist. But a lot of people, their ethnic and social identity is very strong. And so these sorts of conclusions, you know, push at that. What I would say to them, and I say to Indians, is, well, this was always true or not. Ultimately, nothing has changed. The science will ultimately converge on a final answer, which will be solved by ancient DNA, which is happening right now.
Okay, so before we head into the realm of ancient DNA and what's being done, we talked a lot about the Y chromosome. What about the rest of the genome?
Yeah, and so this is a complicated issue, partly because, as Spencer and I have talked about offline, it all hangs together. So it's not just the Y chromosome, right? So you can only say so much from one locus, which is what the Y chromosome really is. If you look at the whole genome, Indians, you can model them as a compound of two broad population clusters. One population cluster, David Reich's lab has labeled Ancestral South Indians. Their closest relatives that are alive today are Andaman Islanders, but that's actually a relatively distant relationship going back to, say, 20, 25,000 years, last glacial maximum. And then
and so this probably is the kind of underlying substructure of the Indian subcontinent.
Yeah. It's what makes Indians distinctive, right? And then there's another component, which David Reich's lab called Ancestral North Indian. It's becoming more and more obvious that that's actually a mix of multiple elements. Like some of it is Iranian farmers from the Neolithic. Other aspects of it look a lot like steppe populations, which we were just talking about with the R1A. So these are two different independent lines of evidence, right? And the Ancestral North Indian, it's extremely genetically similar to other West Eurasian populations. And why that is important is many Indians date the origin of the ethnogenesis of these populations. Because, you know, Indians, I mean, they read the papers, so they see these labels, but they date them very far back into the Pleistocene. So they say the Ancestral North Indians were there when the Ice Ages ended. And they lived in northern India, and they were strongly segregated from southern Indians. The question that I would have then is, how are they genetically so similar to other populations in Eurasia? You know, these sorts of genetic connections are not trivial, especially over these distances. Not only that, the Ancestral North Indians are a combination of multiple populations. So if you go to the scientific principle of parsimony, you know, what's the simplest model to explain this? It's not that the Ancestral North Indians were always there. It's that they're actually a recent combination of other populations. And other populations means outside of India, which means there was an intrusion from outside of India. And then we can just go back to what we were saying about R1A. And so combining these two makes an extremely persuasive case.
Yeah, I agree with you, but let's play devil's advocate for a moment. India is kind of a cul-de-sac. It's like a drinking vessel, a glass. And so the stuff at the bottom, down near Sri Lanka, Tamil Nadu, is kind of isolated by whatever is north of that. And so if anything's going to move, it's going to be the people at the north.
Yeah.
And they could have moved out of India into the Middle East and, across the steppe and into, Western Eurasia.
Yeah.
So that in principle.
No, in theory, it's still possible.
However, what we don't see is any evidence of the ancestral South Indian component in Europe.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, is pretty compelling evidence that it was the other way around. People moved from Europe, or what we consider to be kind of Eastern Europe today, down into the steppes and into India.
Yeah. So, we're talking like huge levels of long-term segregation for many millennia for the out of India to frankly work at this point, because ancestral South Indian ancestry, you don't see it beyond a few parts of Iran and Afghanistan that are just adjacent. And there's been history of like slavery, Muslim raids into India. So that's easily explained, but you don't see it in Central Asia. And, the key is, for me, one of the most persuasive aspects is the earliest R1A, which is actually of the Indian branch of R1A, are the Srubna remains in the Pontic steppe. And they don't look Indian in terms, they don't have the distinctive Indian signatures. They have the steppe signatures. Right? So the case is not closed, but if you were going to make bets on what the jury was going to come back with as a verdict, it's pretty obvious that something going into India is probably the most scientifically defensible position. Now, I do have to say, some Hindu nationalist friends have told me this is very psychologically difficult for many Indians to accept, especially how they've grown up and been raised over the last generation. The dominant model has been out of India. And, frankly, I've gone to conferences where Indian scientists will say that there's no evidence for this sort of migration, even when their slides make it rather plain to me that there is such evidence. And I've talked to other people, and they have agreed with me about this. There's an extremely strong ideological push for a particular answer. And the way scientists work is they get funding from government agencies. So people will come to some conclusions sometimes because it's the most convenient conclusion. And this isn't limited to Indians. Ideology affects human beings in general, so I'm not pointing fingers. Unfortunately for Indians, though, once the ancient DNA comes out, we will know. And I am very enthusiastic about ancient DNA, which I think should tell you what I think it will say. I'm not fearful of it. If the Hindu nationalists who believe in out of India, if they want to fund ancient DNA, that's great. But I would wonder if they actually want to know the answer, which is, that's a common issue. People sometimes just don't want to know the answer. It bothers them. But that's not the scientific way, right? So this is a conflict between different aspects of human nature. Do you want to know? Do you want the truth? Or do you want your myths?
You can't handle the truth.
Yeah. Well,
so what is the state of play on the ancient DNA? Surely people are working on this because it's a big unsolved question.
People keep asking me that, and I ask around.
The thing to do would be to go into some of these Harappan settlements and look before and after the collapse. And do you see a genetic shift?
Well, and the Harappans also they buried people under their houses. So the practice of cremation was introduced later. So we would actually be able to get some. And so there is a site in Punjab that I'm not going to try to say it because I can't pronounce it. I'm not going to lie. But, they
you speak Bengali, though, I thought.
Yeah.
Which is kind of close.
Yeah, but I don't
okay.
Too many syllables. And, in any case, but they have DNA. I think a year and a half ago, they started saying that they were going to publish something. And there's a lab in Korea that's working on it in collaboration. So it's not, I don't have any contacts at this lab.
So why Korea?
I think maybe
North Korea?
No.
Okay.
I'm hoping not. I think I Googled this lab once. I think it's in South Korea. But I think they want to make sure, because if they publish something explosive, they need to defend themselves. And, frankly, India is a country where there's social political violence. Some people are interested in, before we, get off, I will say, so I am writing an article for India Today right now on these sorts of topics. And one of the reasons I feel comfortable writing about this topic is I live in the United States and nobody in the United States cares about this. Either way. If I wrote this in India, I would probably have to worry a little that some crazy person, to American listeners, this is going to sound insane. That some crazy person would physically attack me or target my family. That this is totally feasible in such a huge nation where, people are getting killed over accusations of eating beef in India right now. So these are very explosive topics, right?
Yeah.
And so
it comes down to identity,
Yes.
and it's the whole post-colonial thing.
Yeah.
I mean, as you said,
Yeah.
this is a big part of Indian history.
yeah.
And so, it's gotten tied up in all of those issues as well,
Yeah.
which is a shame.
Which is a shame. And I think initially we're going to we will know the answers within a couple of years with the rate ancient DNA is going, right? We'll know all the answers. And at that point, Hindu nationalists, they have to make a decision. Some of them are just going to go full creationist in terms of they're just going to deny about what the science is, which is what creationists do. They say that evolution hasn't been proven. There's a lot of scientists that disagree with that, which is a lie. But that's what they tell people, tell themselves. And then other Hindu nationalists, and I have a close friend, who is of that political persuasion. He has no problem. I mean, he wasn't super excited about some of the science, but he has no problem with the science. Like, I explained it to him, he understood, and he is personally somewhat worried because, how do we feel about creationists in the United States? They're, we kind of make fun of them. We have perceptions that they're backward people, right? So he's worried that if Hindu nationalists continue to stay, believing in these things that are obviously wrong, just anyone can figure it out that it's wrong, that it's going to actually have an effect on the whole ideology, at least its international perception. It already has, frankly, a negative, valence with a lot of people abroad, and he doesn't think that this sort of thing will help. It'll make it even more of a laughing stock. And there's already issues with Ayurvedic science and other things that they promote. If you Google it, you'll see it, right? This is not going to help. But I mean, this is the world we live in terms of it's international science, and other people don't have your taboos, and they're going to look. And the reality is, there are Indians who live abroad. You can get their genetics and check it. Some of these answers that we're coming to are with samples from people living abroad. It's an international world, and you can't really stop the march of truth. You can just slow it down. You can obfuscate it and maybe hide it from your followers, but then we're talking about propaganda manipulation, and that's a different topic.
Okay. Well, I think we'll end there.
Okay.
This has been fun.
All right.
For more information about Incytome, our podcasts, and our genetic products, check out our website at incyto.me. That's INSITO.me.